If you don't already know Cedric's work, which I think everybody on the call does, chances are you've probably accidentally read his stuff if you hang around on Hacker News or Reddit. I certainly know that his tacit knowledge post made the rounds, a few months ago. And over the past kind of 10 years or so, Cedric has been blogging about everything from like the publishing industry to career moats, to why kind of popular ideas like deliberate practice are often like misunderstood or, kind of flat out wrong in certain ways. And one of the really cool things about Cedric's background is that he's kind of a doer who then writes to kind of, distill a lot of what he's learned. And I'm really thrilled to talk about how he's used writing and specifically how he's used his blog to kind of be something that helps him sharpen his thinking and really go deep on interesting topics. So first of all, Cedric, thank you for making the time.
Thank you.
Cool. So I wanted to start with one example of a popular idea that when I read your post on it, I was like, thank goodness someone wrote this, because I had a hunch that this was widely misunderstood, and that is deliberate practice. And so I'm curious to hear from you, what is wrong about the common notion or the popular conception of deliberate practice?
Right. So the popular conception of deliberate practice is probably Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000-hour rule. And I think when most people think about deliberate practice, and many authors have sort of referenced it over the years, they say it, they use deliberate practice as an example of like the most well-established field of research on skill acquisition, which is obviously interesting to us, right? Like many of you in the call are writers, and you want to get improved in your writing, and so you would think that deliberate practice would be useful to you, but the problem is that it's really difficult to put into practice. Ask anyone who has actually tried to use deliberate practice in their domain, and especially if the domain is not a domain with established, like a long history of established pedagogical practice, it's pretty much impossible to do deliberate practice as described by Erickson. And so the reason for that is because Erickson focused on fields with an established history of pedagogical practice. Examples of this are like chess and music and what else? Tennis, I suppose. And he did this because, before Erickson did his research, we really didn't know how practice can be effective and what effective practice is. And in fact, I think one of the most important contributions that Erickson established was that naive practice, which is like, endless, mindless repetitions of movements, do not produce competency. Like they do not make you a better practitioner. So that's useful. But the problem with deliberate practice is that if you're not in a field with an established pedagogical history, then you're flat out of luck, right? So the skills required to create the pedagogical practice is completely different from the skills required to do deliberate practice under the guidance of a coach with the benefit of some pedagogical history in your domain. So that's most of us, right? Computer programming, business, management, none of these fields that are important to our careers have deliberate practice like, handles or hooks that you can use. So that's pretty much, I think, I really wish people didn't talk so much about deliberate practice, or at least they actually tried and they mentioned in their blog posts, in their writing, how difficult it is to put a deliberate practice program to practice.
Yeah, it's funny. I think that's a perfect segue into something you wrote about recently. But really, I think maybe the core theme, if there is one amongst a lot of your writing, is practice and really application as the test or the bar for ideas. So actually kind of going out into the world and observing how the world works, using that as fuel for what you write about and kind of what your actual beliefs are. But I'm curious, kind of in your own words, what you mean by practice is the bar for truth, and how you think about being kind of an observer and how it informs your writing.
Right. So I think that practice is a shortcut. So a lot of the things that I write about are things that I've either put through trial and error, or I've actually tried to put into practice, and then I'm writing up notes based on what I've tried or what hasn't worked for me. And the cool thing about this is that there is a rigor that comes from practice, right? If it works for me, it's likely to work for someone else. And my confidence goes up if I'm able to generalize or synthesize like a general principle from observation, from practice, and teach that to someone else. If I can get even, or at least one other person to become better because of something I noticed or something that I've synthesized, then I know that there's something to it, right? And I know then when I write about it, it's probably going to resonate with people. The problem is usually finding the words to express this thing that we've managed to capture about the world. So I so there are a lot of writers, I think, online, especially in the self-help space, where they basically take an idea, they read about it on some other blog or some other book, and then they summarize it and then they present it as if like it works. And I feel that that's not a high enough bar when it comes to things that are actionable, or things that you can actually apply to your life, right? You should at least present, and it's quite easy actually. You try it out and then you write up notes. If it didn't work for you, that's still valuable information, right? That's valuable information to somebody who's trying to get it to work, and they're having some difficulty applying it. And so if you write up notes on like what you've tried, that is valuable in itself. But of course, I think a lot of the things that commonplace, I mean, the blog is known for, that I write about, is when I've successfully synthesized something, and that practice is really just noticing when something doesn't add up. So let reality let reality teach you, or I think the way I phrase it in the blog is that let reality be the teacher. That's one of my principles. So whenever possible, try to figure out a test or a way to get reality, to test it against reality, and notice when reality is trying to tell you something, because that gives you the best ideas or content to write about, I think.
Yeah, and what are some of your cues that reality is kind of revealing a lesson to you, or maybe beating one into you? I'm curious, what are some of those cues that you kind of use as
Right.
a trigger that, hey, this might actually be really interesting and worth writing about?
So I guess one example would be the deliberate practice example. Before the call, we were talking about like how we were both managers, and when you're a manager, one of the things that you have to do is you have to do training, right? You have to teach your subordinates, because if you don't train them, you can't delegate. And then if they mess things up, right, that's on you because you didn't train them properly. And so the whole deliberate practice and tacit knowledge thing came out of the observation that, so my team had a bottleneck. We had a senior my tech lead basically, who was really good at designing the architecture for a new feature or a new program, and we would always bottleneck on him approving whatever architecture it was. And so I found that it was easy to onboard new hires. It was easy to teach them the code base and teach them basic, good hygiene practices for programming. But it was really difficult to teach this high level skill that only my tech lead seemed to have. Even I didn't really have it. And so I wanted to figure out how to teach it. I also wanted to learn how to acquire it for myself, because he seemed to always pick like the right level of abstractions, the right level of rigidity but flexibility, so that when business requirements change down the road, we will not have to rewrite large parts of the code. I couldn't figure it out. And so I was really digging into like, how do I put deliberate practice to use? Didn't seem to work. Is there something, that he has that I don't? Is it some talent? Is it like genetic? That there's no way that I could pick it up, and therefore there's no way I could teach it to other people, right? And so eventually that led to a rabbit hole where I left the deliberate practice literature behind, and that's one thing I think that is particularly useful for online writers to keep in mind. Very often, what is known exists out there in the academic literature, but very often researchers don't talk to each other because of the way the incentives are done in science. And I think there's this book, it's not a very good book, but it's an entertaining book, Range by David Epstein, I think, where he points out that like there are advantages to people who are good at finding information and synthesizing across domains, because there's so much siloed information out there, right? And so if you leave the deliberate practice world behind, you would find in a neighborhood around deliberate practice, and the authors from both domains have actually collaborated on publications before, you'll find a domain called naturalistic decision making, and in there you will find a model of expertise that explain what I was observing with my tech lead, with a lot of other people that I admired in my domain, and as well as in judo, because I used to play competitively in judo. And so that ability to like be very curious and then follow your nose, right? To find something that matches the observations that you have, and not discounting the observations you have. I think that's the key.
You mentioned something that I thought was interesting, which is almost sharing your direct experience with kind of implementing an idea or running experience in reality, and almost writing in more of a documenting type of way versus
Yes.
sharing some underlying principle. Or I'm curious how you think
Yes,
about
yes,
that
yes.
as a means of communicating your experience.
Right. So there are some posts on Commonplace where I don't successfully explicate some underlying principle. And what I do in those cases is I just write up like, here's my experience, and I tell a story, right? Or I have some sort of it's basically just imagine like I'm sitting down with you, we're getting coffee, and I'm telling you like, hey, I've tried this thing, I've not really got it to work. I think that maybe it's not worked because of this and this and this, and this is really useful if you can't you're stuck with something and you don't really know why it's not working, but it's still valuable information to other practitioners reading your blog, right? Because if you tell them what hasn't worked for you, they usually readers are smart enough to sort of adapt that to their own lived experiences, right? And sort of pick out things from what you've noticed about your experience to apply or adapt or change to them. And sometimes some of the most interesting emails that I get from readers are from things that I haven't fully figured out. But then I write about like, here's what I tried. I'm not really sure like what this means. I think an example of that is recently, at the end of last year, I wrote a series about forecasting. And then I wrote about like how it's really difficult to forecast when as we can tell, I mean, the last couple of months have shown that to be true, right? With the pandemic. Um, and then I said that it seems like a lot of business people, very successful business people, Charlie Munger included, they don't bother with forecasting at all, right? Instead, they bother with, they try to prime themselves to be very observant, and they design their organizations to be highly adaptive. And I have no idea what's going on there, but I noticed it. I wrote about it. In fact, in one of my newsletters, I said like I wrote something like, I don't know what's going on here, but I'm going to find out. And then like readers, like I think 3 or 4 people have emailed me over the past couple of months with like observations and further topics to investigate.
Yeah, and that's a perfect segue into I think how you have gone about kind of communicating a lot of these experiences, because I think there's a lot of pressure when you're a writer to
Yes.
distill that underlying principle to come up with the grand unifying theory of product management, finance, whatever your kind of field is. When in reality, right, you're basically saying, hey, I've just noticed that Charlie Munger, for example, is a very observant person and doesn't get obsessed with forecasting, and that's unusual because that's not really talked about. So
Yep.
when you start to kind of maybe catch on these things that look interesting and worth pursuing, I'm curious to maybe go into how you actually write and think about communicating maybe your experience chasing these things. A
Right.
reader might not be as curious about the same things as you are. So I'm curious, when you're kind of putting together a draft, how do you think about framing it in a way that makes it interesting to read? And yeah, maybe I'll leave it
Hmm.
there.
Um, wow. There's actually there's a lot in that single question, right? So like one is like, how do you draft a complex abstract idea? But then like implicit in that question is this how do you get the idea in the first place, right? So practice is not practice is good, because usually by the time you've gone through the entire process of putting something to practice, you have a lot of thoughts, especially if you're thoughtfully putting it to practice, right? Thoughtfully putting it to trial and error. But at the same time, there are ideas where I'm not that clear about. And so in those cases, I do 2 things. One is I read around the topic. So either I read stories, because stories are easier to read, right? If you're really tired, you don't really want to grapple with a nonfiction book that's all principles. You want to sit back with something that is more narrative driven, because your brain is well adapted to narratives. And when you read around the topic, you usually can start seeing patterns. So you don't read one book, you read a couple of books, and you try to sort of like figure out a way into the topic, especially if the topic is really difficult. So example would be there's this formula called the Kelly criterion, and it's used to evaluate bets. And if you have no time or energy to look into that field, you can start with Fortune's formula, which is this nice, awesome nonfiction book. It has the mafia in it, that talks about the formula and the history of the formula. The other thing I do is I talk to friends. So usually the first draft of many of my ideas are in conversations with friends where I'm trying to explain something to them. And then I'm failing miserably most of the time. So like usually when you see the output of a blog post where it's, you know, well explicated and the ideas are well formed, and you know, people walk away with the feeling like, oh, you know, that's what's going on. Like he found the words to describe this thing that I was experiencing. What you don't see is the endless months of conversations with random people where I just completely screw it up. But the interesting thing is that over time, you know, it becomes easier. So that's the first part of the question. Like, how do you refine the idea to the point where you can even write about it? The second part, so that's difficult because I don't really know how the ideas come out. I think this is true for many writers. You have a frame, you know if it works or if it's not working. If it's not working, you most writers I know, myself included, have ways of like either trying to rescue the piece or just throwing everything out and rewriting. Um, uh, we talked a little about, I don't know, Benjamin Franklin's sort of technique for training story structure. So okay, wait, let's jump back to that for a bit. I promise not to take more than 1 minute. So I said the deliberate practice has problems, but one thing that I haven't written about, perhaps because I haven't figured out a way to communicate this, is that there are useful ideas in deliberate practice, and one of them is there is a particular feel to a deliberate practice type of activity. And the example of this that I like to give is that chess players do not get better by playing chess. They get better by practicing and looking at past games, and usually it's like a list of moves, right, that they can bring around with them on a piece of paper. And the way they train is that they cover up the next move of the grandmaster, and they try to figure out what's the next move that they're going to make, try to replicate the grandmaster's game. And if they fail, then they try to figure out like why did the grandmaster make that move and why they did not. So this is an example of a practice activity that is very contained. I will link this back to writing in a bit. It has a fast feedback loop, and it's a simulation of part of the task, the actual task, which is playing a full chess game. But it's a lot faster to practice, easier to practice, because it's a tiny subset of a chess game. Similarly, and Erickson writes about this in Peak, Benjamin Franklin, when he was trying to get better at writing, what he would do is he would take a piece that he admired and he would cut it up with scissors, and then he would put it in a drawer. And he would do this for many pieces that he admired. And then he would come back a few weeks later and take out the pieces and try to rearrange them in a way that matched the structure of the original piece. Similarly, he would take a piece he admired, summarize it, walk away, come back, and then try to, from that summary, reproduce the piece in the tone and the style of the author that he admired. So this is a very deliberate, practicey kind of activity. And I think, to answer your question about like how I figure out a way to structure an abstract idea, I think a lot of it is tacit. You know what works, you know what story structure or like what narrative nonfiction piece structure might work for your idea. And the way to get there is to do something similar to Benjamin Franklin, which is to go and practice story structure explicitly. I think I picked it up over time, but I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and I'm curious too. One thing that you've talked about, we talked about a bit before the call about this, but I'm curious for you to maybe elaborate a bit. You've also described kind of the job of the writer or the process of writing to be almost synonymous with skiing downhill, I think was like the analogy that you used. And I'm really curious to like, for you to elaborate on kind of what you mean by that.
Right.
So,
So writing online is not like writing a book. And the reason for that is because people are, you know, there's like a gajillion other things that they can do. They can like go check Twitter or play Candy Crush or whatever. And so what you want to do is you want to grab hold of the reader's attention early on in the piece. And I don't mean this in like a clickbaity sort of way. There are many subtle ways to grab the reader's attention. One trick that I've noticed a lot of writers doing is they use narrative. So if you read The New Yorker, you read Malcolm Gladwell, you read David Epstein, who's actually quite good at this, is that he would use a story instead of making a point. He would use an incredibly well-told story with a background that, you know, the characters are interesting. He gives them enough background to like sort of allow you to follow along. And I think of these as like good I call this ramps, right? So like these are ramps where you can speed up and you know that you're not going to lose the reader. The reader is like, oh man, I just chewed through this really difficult section in your piece where you present some abstract formula and there's math symbols. Oh my God. And then you follow this up or you sandwich this between two story sections, right? So their brain is like, whoosh, and then like gets stuck on this terrible piece, which is technical writing, and then whoosh again. So you pretty much, when I edit my piece, I'm always asking myself, is there enough like speed here? Is there enough speed to keep the reader going to the next section? Narrative is one way of doing that. Other ways is teasing what might come. So this is sort of using story structure, but not in an explicit narrative. So you're teasing the reader as a protagonist at the beginning of the piece, and by the end of the piece, they will be a slightly better person in some way, right? So this is like another way to hook their attention and keep them going. Another idea is to seem more insightful. And so one way that you do this is you take a truth that they already agree with. And if you say it in the typical form, it's called a cliche. But if you repackage it, right, it's called an insight. It's not really an insight. It's just something that, they think they already agree with. And so it's like butter, right? Where they're like, oh yeah, I totally agree with this. And like, oh yeah, the author has my viewpoint on the wall, and so I shall continue reading. So that's another trick. And you actually become a lot more aware of such tricks when you are a writer yourself. So I'm a lot more cynical / critical reader because of this.
Totally. Once you see behind the scenes of something,
Yeah.
what's being used on you. So one thing you've also mentioned is Roy Peter Clark's kind of classic book, 50
Yes.
writing tools, and that being a really influential piece of work on how you think about structuring these pieces. And I'm just curious if there's any kind of big takeaways from that book or from the general advice that he gives that might be useful for kind of any writer, whether they be online writers or book writers.
Oh, wow.
But I'm kind of curious what the major impacts have been from that book on you.
So that's a good question. I think Roy Peter Clark gave me the basic ability to write. I was a kid when I was a teenager when I first read his stuff, and at the time he was publishing like a post a week free online at Pointer, the website. And now of course he's taken it offline. I think it's a free course. I think they made it free for a temporary, I don't know, for a short period of time. I'm not sure if it's still free. You can go Google it. Pointer course, 50 writing tools. It's also a book. And so what the book is, it's a collection of, exactly as it says on the tin, 50 writing tools. And the tools are all very tiny, small pieces, like watch word space, like don't repeat words too near each other, which I'm sure all of us sort of internalize if you've written a bit. But he also does things like, if you want to write really long sentences, make sure the verb and the noun are very close to the start of the sentence. Then you can like make the sentence as long as you want. And I sometimes abuse this. J.K. Rowling certainly does. If you noticed, once you learn of this rule, you can't unsee it. But he also goes into higher level sort of skills. Like an example of this is if you are talking about some emotionally salient or emotionally heavy thing, pare down your language, use simpler words, use shorter sentences. I mean, like the typical thing is you want to vary sentence length because that freshens the reader. But you want to pare down your language. And the great thing about Roy Peter Clark is that he uses examples of amazing journalism to make his point. So he gives you an example of a very powerful piece. I can't remember what it was. And he draws your attention to the fact that the author deliberately sort of pares down his vocabulary for that period. And that leaves an impact on you. And the nice thing about 50 writing tools is that you work your way through it by, you read one tool, you try to integrate it into your practice, then you read the next tool, and you don't allow yourself to get too far ahead as you're putting it to practice. And that's how I got good at the basics.
So and by the way, we'll move into Q&A here in like 1 or 2 minutes. So if any questions have come up, I'll stick to our time here. Go ahead and type them in the Zoom chat, and then when we go into the Q&A, we'll start to go down them. So one thing I'm curious about is like, you definitely have kind of serious fans and readers who love your work. I'm really curious how you think about, and this is a question that came up before we jumped on the call from the group, how you think about being an online writer and kind of finding distribution and finding great readers. You've thought a lot about
Right.
kind of the publishing industry and how the internet's disrupting it. But I'm curious for people who are just kind of starting to share their ideas more online, how would you encourage them to kind of, get their first few readers and their first 10 fans, if you will?
Right. So the first thing that I tell friends when they want to start writing is like, don't worry, nobody will read it. And usually this is very helpful to people who are new to writing online, because writing online is terrifying, right? It really is quite terrifying. I can't remember how it felt like when I first started, but I know from working with a couple of friends who want to get serious about their writing that for a lot of people, putting yourself out there is very scary. Uh, and I think if you're faced with sort of like that kind of beginner, right, you shouldn't scare them away with too much writing knowledge. You should say like, just get it, build a cadence. Don't worry, for the first 6 months, nobody will read your stuff. And so you can take time to develop a voice. I think it took, I don't know, 6 months, 8 months before anyone noticed anything on Commonplace, right? And so I sort of look back to that time with some fondness, because I was really experimenting with the format and trying to figure out like what I wanted to write about. For distribution, first things first, you should write something that is high quality, right? Where ideally something that nobody has written about before. And if you have that one piece in place, everything becomes a lot easier. The second thing is that you can and you should try to share your links on communities. So one thing I like about Reddit is that there's a community for everything. And if you have lots of varied interests, right, you can sort of go and try and post links to your piece on Reddit and try your luck there. The other thing, of course, is if you are comfortable with the idea, you've already gotten past the initial hump of being scared of sharing yourself, right? Share it on social media, right? You'll be surprised by your friends who reaches out to you. One particular tip there is go and share on LinkedIn, because LinkedIn is so full of shitty content that if you have reasonably good content, even if like it's just decent content, you would do so well. And yeah, it's surprised me multiple times over the past couple of months where somebody that I know in my network, like I actually know in person, but I've maybe lost contact with, I reach out on LinkedIn and say, hey, I want to talk about that piece that you posted to your LinkedIn. I was like, okay, cool. LinkedIn is not completely a waste of time. I hope that answers your question. I don't know.
No, it's wonderful. I love that. Don't worry, nobody will read your stuff, right? Because there's these two totally countervailing narratives of I'm so bummed no one's reading my stuff, and also I'm terrified of being judged. And you got to kind of pick one.
Yes.
So I do love Don't worry, no one's going to read your stuff anyways for the first few months. Well, amazing. So we're right on time. So I will keep us to the schedule here. It is Q&A time. Philip, I think you are going to lead us off if you're still available, and you can actually unmute Philip if you'd like, and you can ask your question. Otherwise, I will go ahead and read it.
Oh, hey, can you guys hear me?
Hey, yep.
Hey, Cedric.
Clear.
This is Philip. So, yeah, I guess I was surprised to hear about your comment about Range not being a good book. I was just wondering if you could expand on that a little bit.
Sure. I'm very frustrated by Range because I think some of the ideas that he touches on are super, super interesting. I have a summary queued up. I haven't finished the summary. I'm sort of still working through my thoughts, but it's basically if you take a really good meaty topic and then you decide to take the Malcolm Gladwell approach to writing about it, which Malcolm Gladwell's approach is completely make your point through stories. And I'm a firm believer in like the power of stories and the power of stories to sort of get past, like, I talked about using them as speed bumps, right? But there is a point where you should stop writing stories and make your argument. And I feel like the book is like cotton candy, right? There's so much sweet and good, and his narrative is amazing. The stories he picks is amazing, but I want the argument as well, right? So I feel like it's a wasted effort. And the funny thing is that his blog is actually really good with, I mean, his newsletter. So he has a newsletter, but he sort of posts it online. It's really good. And when you hear him on podcasts, right, you can tell that he's done the work, he's read the research, right? But it doesn't come through in his writing. And I suspect it's because of the way the publishing industry works. Because when you're writing a book like Range, you want the largest possible audience. And so you have to tone down sort of some of the research that you're quoting, which is, yeah, very frustrated.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, it's a great question because that book's sitting somewhere in my apartment, and yeah, that it's funny. I think there's only so many books where the Gladwell formula works the whole way through.
Yes.
So yeah, yeah, for better or worse. Cool. So Jonathan, I think you're next up. If you are able to unmute, feel free to ask your question.
Hi. So deliberate practice being the right way to do things or not, you've clearly thought about your writing deliberately, and you're from practice writing deliberately. I was just curious, have you tried the Ben Franklin approach? And if so,
right. So two levels to your question. One is that deliberate practice is not about whether you practice deliberately. It is defined as a form of practice that takes place in a domain with pedagogical history, with under the guidance of an instructor, with focus on what you're bad at, right? So like it's a very specific, it's a technical name. It's not, are you practicing deliberately or not? It's possible to do naive practice, as Erickson talks about, deliberately. I have thought about it deliberately, but no, I haven't used the Ben Franklin method, because what I do is when I read pieces, like I have certain writers that I really admire. Like for example, actually, you know what? Just take any piece from the New Yorker or the Economist. They're quite good with structure, and what I do is when I'm reading the piece, I'm trying to figure out like what ideas are the author trying to communicate, especially if it's a longer piece, because longer pieces are more difficult. They get unwieldy very fast. And then I try to sort of figure out like, okay, if these are the ideas, and I keep them all in my head, because it's actually quite doable to do that for a New Yorker piece, like a typical magazine piece, even though it's fairly long. It's okay to, you keep the ideas in your head, and you ask yourself like, how would I structure this piece? What other alternative structures are possible, and why has the author or the editor decided to use this particular structure, right? And so that's what I did. I only learned about the Benjamin Franklin method when I wrote the summary for Peak, because Erickson talks about this in the book. And so one post that I want to write about in the future is like how, yes, deliberate practice might not apply to your domain, but you can tell that Erickson picks up on deliberate practice-y type of activities. There is a feel to deliberate practice type activities, and developing that feel is useful. And even if you are not in a domain where you have pedagogical approach, established pedagogical approach. There's actually a guy on Medium, I can't remember his name, that is really good at this. He's definitely internalized it, and so his entire thing is trying to take the deliberate practice approach and come up with deliberate practice type activities for domains that don't have an established pedagogical approach. So in Peak, Erickson sort of makes a throwaway remark that it doesn't apply. You can't use deliberate practice for crossword puzzle solving. And then this guy takes it as a challenge, and you can go Google it. And he writes a really long Medium post where he becomes like a master New York Times crossword solver in a month. And when you read his thing, you can tell that he has internalized what feels like a deliberate practice activity and what doesn't.
That's wonderful. And I'm just a maybe quick follow on there. Is that that feel of something that feels like deliberate practice? I'm just curious, does that segue a bit into like your concept of tacit knowledge and some of what you've written there? Does it have, do you see kind of some overlap there?
Yes. I really do think that the practitioners of Erickson's the deliberate practice field research, they know it when they see it, right? And so I think what's valuable in that domain, apart from the observation that Erickson made, that naive practice is actually harmful to skill acquisition. The valuable thing there is trying to go after that feeling. When you can recognize it, you know, right, this is more likely to work than other approaches, even if you're in a domain that doesn't, where the pedagogical approach isn't established yet.
100%. Wonderful. Raj, you are next up if you're able to unmute. Otherwise, I'm happy to read your question.
Yeah. Hi, Cedric. I'm a big fan of your work.
Thank you.
So my question is, so I'm a PhD student, and I'm trying to figure out good ways to apply tacit knowledge approaches to my work and deliberate practice where it makes sense. Have you found others in other domains than yours that adapt similar approaches to you, or like how would you recommend finding them?
What do you mean by adapt similar approaches to me?
Or I guess your the way you structure your blog is you practice or
Right.
you use reality as the teacher, and you distill principles based off of how your experiences go.
I'll have to think about that. I don't think so. I would quite like it if members of Compound like adopt this approach, because then it wouldn't feel so lonely. I really like reading about practitioners. I guess there's a member of Compound called Eugene Yan, and yeah, he does that for ML, right? For machine learning. His whole thing is like what actually works. There's a lot of research out there, but like what has organizations actually put to practice. And then he sort of just always blog posts is like, this is what worked for me, or this is what worked for my team, or this is what worked for Uber, and let's like take a look at what Uber did. But yeah, I don't know that many, which is oh wait, I guess the guy, I should go find what the name of the guy is, the one who did the whole deliberate practice series on Medium. Let me just pull it up. We can move on to the next question if you want, but let me just
Totally, yeah, feel free to pull it up. And actually, perfect timing, because our next question is actually from Eugene. Eugene,
wow.
I know it's a small world, so we've got Eugene on the line. Does not have a mic though, so I'll be the translator here with no mic. But Eugene asked about kind of your writing practice, and specifically, you ship something every week, and typically it's a non-trivial blog post. And feel free to interrupt if you've got the name pulled up there.
I got it. Max Deutsch is his name. He is amazing. You should go interview
Max
him.
Deutsch. Boom. Okay, it's in the chat. So Max Deutsch, awesome. A doer, a practitioner.
Yes, he is amazing.
Awesome. We'll email that out with the kind of the notes afterwards, because that sounds super interesting. Awesome. Great question. So Eugene's question was around your actual kind of writing workflow and how you actually kind of ship something every week. And so we'll start there. There's a couple parts of the question, but can you just share some details about your workflow that helps you kind of keep up that output without sacrificing quality?
So I write in an app called Ulysses. It's a Mac iOS app. Allows me to write on the go as well on iPhone and on iPad. My entire thing is, if I have an idea, right, I create a new post, a new document, and then I write the title, and it's usually a very bad title at the beginning, and then I write like a few comments. So you can make comments in Ulysses where when you export the final thing, it doesn't appear in the final text. And my structure of many pieces are written in comments first. Usually I write a statement at the beginning saying, this is what I want the reader to take away from the piece, right? And sometimes that's very long. And in the past, so like my mental model series is incredibly dense because it boils down like 6 books, one of which was a 600-page textbook and like countless other research papers. That was probably a mistake. Most people who read the series don't get that much out of it. They get like maybe 20%. So ever since that series, one of the things that I've been working on as a writer is to try to pare down the number of ideas. So it really helps to like write it's not a thesis statement, it's like a takeaway statement. This is the point I want to make, right, at the beginning, and that's the North Star for the entire piece. And then the actual structure itself is actually quite messy. So I don't structure out the piece from at the beginning. Sometimes that's a mistake, especially if the idea that I want to communicate is very complex. So the Text and Knowledge series, for example, I made a mistake in the beginning. I wanted to write one blog post, and I realized that there's too much. And so this is where some upfront planning would have helped. But usually when I write, it becomes clearer as I'm writing. Because there's always this process of discovery, right? That happens with writing. Paul Graham talks about this, for example, because his writing process is he just sits down and he blurts everything out, and then like he sends it to lots of readers, and then he edits. So you do that. You have drafts in various stages of readiness, and usually I know from looking at the drafts like which are more ready to more susceptible to an attack, to writing, and I don't really want to. I have made the mistake before where I didn't have a lot of well thought out drafts, and so when I sat down to write for the piece for the week, I had to like take something that wasn't fully fleshed out, and those are the worst. Like there are some pieces that took me 18 hours to write, and it felt like wringing blood out of a stone because it wasn't well established, and I had to do a lot of thinking during the writing. Ideally, that doesn't happen, but sometimes it does. Does that answer your question? I guess. Oh, research process, right? So I know you're a practitioner of the Xanthocasten method, Eugene. I am not as organized. Usually I have this like huge papers folder in my Dropbox that contains like, I don't know, a gajillion papers, scientific papers, and I have a number of books going at any given time. So if I want to write about a topic, usually I queue up a bunch of papers and books, and then I read about that nonstop for weeks. So example of that would be my post on John Boyd and the OODA loop. I think I read 3 books and a couple of papers, and I only produced 2 blog posts, which is quite disappointing. But I basically just block out the time for that period. If I'm writing about that topic, then that's all I'm reading about. How many iterations are you writing? Sorry. Usually a lot. I mean, sometimes a lot. Usually I usually rewrite as I go, and maybe that's not very good, but I don't know. It's what I've always done.
Yeah, I did have a follow-up question there, which is kind of a question around your editing process. You typically self-edit. You mentioned you do kind of ask friends for feedback and pitch your ideas before you start writing to folks. But I am curious, like what that actual kind of like editing and almost feedback part of the workflow looks like.
Right. So talking to friends is usually when I'm hashing out an idea in the early stages when I don't really know what I'm trying, or I have an idea, I have some notion of it, I don't know how to express it. The example, I just had an example where I was trying to explain the whole field of deliberate practice that I've never written about it. I don't know if I can write about that, but I'm sort of taken a step closer to getting that to a publishable stage by talking to you guys, right? The editing process is, so I only ask friends for feedback when it's like a very important piece, a very contentious piece. So one of my highest impact pieces has actually nothing to do with commonplace. It was a blog post I wrote for Singapore's tech community called The 2 Tiers of Tech Companies in Singapore. And that one, wow, that one had an editing process that I think was 2 or 3 weeks long, where I basically sent it to many friends who were experienced software engineers or people interested in the software ecosystem in Singapore, because it was talking about something very contentious, which was employment in Singapore. Like there are good jobs and there are bad jobs, and here's how you recognize which is a good job in the tech industry in Singapore, right? So that was very dangerous. So I needed to cover every base. But usually most blog posts in Commonplace aren't as tendentious. So I just, I edit, I read it once over, and then I push it out. And sometimes I have a deadline for myself, which is my newsletter, which must go out every Tuesday by midnight my time. And sometimes I don't know when I've hit publish, I'm too tired, I write the newsletter, I send it out. And only the next day, then I come back and I read, I'm like, So yeah.
Wonderful. Philip, if you're still around, feel free to unmute. I think Philip had a question around kind of publishing platforms, and I know that a lot of other people are curious about that as well.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm thinking about getting into writing, and so my question was, are there any benefits to writing on an established platform like Medium for new writers, or do you always recommend new writers start their own blog?
Right. Yes, I recommend that every writer should start their own blog. mostly because, well, like part of it is like when you're starting out to write, you really want a period where people don't read, so you can build the cadence without fear of judgment. And Medium is not that great at not, Medium's whole like thing is to like put your piece of writing in front of as many people as possible. So you want to give yourself the space, but also like I think I've tried Medium before. I have found some readers through Medium, but I don't really think it's a good platform. Like it might die at any moment. It's venture back, which means that it has to justify a certain return to its investors. The second thing is like Medium doesn't have a good history when dealing with third-party partners, so that doesn't inspire confidence. So if you do publish on Medium, make sure that you have a backup on your blog. And for SEO purposes, make sure you publish first on your blog, at least with like a few hours in between before you publish on Medium, because Google will mark the first thing that it sees as canonical. I think I don't know if that's still true for Medium. Like maybe you can do a canonical link, reference, but to keep things simple, publish on your blog, wait 12 hours, 24 hours, and then publish on Medium if you want to do it that way. And in the beginning, that your blog will not have much domain authority, which means it wouldn't rank very highly on Google. But I think it's quite important to have something that you control.
Thanks.
Wonderful. Thanks. Yeah, great question. I know that's a big conversation, definitely a compound of folks trying to figure out, like, if you're bootstrapping an audience, does media make sense to get it off the ground versus your own blog? So I think it's something that certainly what I've seen in compound is like there's never one perfect answer. People have lots of different journeys, but I agree that the risk with Medium is that at the end of the day, it's not your audience. So wonderful. So we actually have one more question from some folks who couldn't make it that I'm certainly really curious to hear about. You've written across a fairly wide range of ideas. Cool. We'll get to this new question as well right after.
Sure.
You've written across kind of a wide range of ideas, obviously, over the past few years, but through writing, what are some of the ideas that have really kind of stuck with you? Obviously, we've talked a bit about, or kind of at length about, your new ideas around deliberate practice. But what are some of those other ideas that through writing your blog, you've really come to kind of internalize and you've almost discovered through the process of writing about it? Curious to hear some of those other big categories where you've been left with a big impression and your kind of worldview has changed.
Oh, wow. Well, where do I begin? So many things.
Right.
I think like the easy one is narrative. So using narrative strategically. Human brains are really adapted to narrative. We probably, I don't know, our ancestors probably learned things by hearing stories from each other, right? And a lot of the cognitive biases and heuristics tradition is sort of dismantling the architecture in our heads, because our bias for stories leads us down very bad paths. Bad paths. But the thing is, because our brain, it's evolved for story and for storytelling, I find that a lot of the interventions around the cognitive biases literature, they don't take into account the fact that it's really difficult to work against the grain of your mind. And so what you should do is to look for interventions that take advantage of your inbuilt storytelling module, as the way I like to think about it. I'll give you an example. So one thing that the cognitive biases literature likes to say is like you need to be able to form calibrated probabilistic assessments of the world, right? That's one way of doing it. So for example, if you see a colleague and he's late every day and your boss doesn't seem to mind, right? You might think like, oh, this colleague is like really lazy and like he should be fired, right? The cognitive bias approach would be like, what are your priors? Update your priors based on observed information. Try to form like a hypothesis for like why that explains his behavior and your boss's behavior, and then update that as it goes along. The storytelling approach, the one that takes advantage of the way your mind actually works, is generate multiple stories, right? Generate multiple alternative stories to the first story that you've generated, that would then allow you to sort of evaluate different explanations for why he's doing it and prevent you from falling into making a bad decision, right, with regard to that colleague. So that has, reading the naturalistic decision-making literature has really driven home like how there are so many ways to use existing cognitive architecture, for better or worse. We're born that way, we're evolved that way, and use that in not only in your writing but in your practice, right? So I use stories quite a bit in my writing when I don't want to seem prescriptive, because I know that storytelling is such a good way to transmit a message, and different readers will take out of it what they will depending on their lived experiences. So I hope that, I don't know, what's your original question?
No, it's a perfect example of something that you've really kind of been turned on to, or has almost been revealed to you as you've written about some of these topics.
Yeah.
Well, wonderful. So KM, I know we're coming up in the last 5 minutes here, so this might be our last question, but KM does not have a mic, so I'll read this one out loud. But skills and understanding fade over time. For example, in the field of software, programmers may not even recognize code they wrote years ago, in my own case, days ago. How much effort do you put into retaining familiarity with what you read about or wrote about in the past? How much effort do you put into retaining and polishing skills that you already have?
Right. So the nice thing about writing a blog is that when you synthesize all that research, it becomes like this artifact that you can refer to, right, over time. So very often when I'm sort of brushing up pieces of the naturalistic decision-making literature, for example, or the deliberate practice literature, I just go back to one of my pieces and read what I've written. It's sort of like a letter to my future self. The problem with that is that Commonplace has a particular topic, a theme. So I can't write about things I'm learning outside of that. For example, I read a lot about business and I have thoughts about like business. And I have one series on the blog called the Chinese Businessman Paradox, where I'm sort of trying to figure out like what's going on with these incredibly irrational, superstitious Chinese businessmen that are successful all across Southeast Asia. And that is pretty much, like I have certain readers who love that series because nobody sort of writes about this. But at the same time, I'm very aware that it has nothing to do with career modes or self-improvement or deliberate practice, right? So the problem with that really is that I can only write about the topic area for the blog because that's how blogs work, right? You want to be known for a certain set of topics. And for me, like the umbrella is career modes, which allows me to write about many, many things, but it's still an umbrella. I know, so I've been curious about Zendokasten. I know there are a lot of people on Twitter who use Roam to organize their thinking. I'm laughing because I have friends in the call, and they're gonna laugh about this because I'm resistant to trying it, and I'm not really sure why, because like part of it maybe is that my current process works for me, and the output that I have is not bad. But at the same time, like there's this voice at the back of my head going like, I'm growing older, cognitive decline begins in your 30s, so maybe I should start investing in one of these systems, these second brain things, before I become like old and like yeah. So you've asked a really good question, because I'm not really sure I'm quite certain that my current approach isn't ideal. To be fair, some people like Paul Graham, for example, once wrote that like, when reading a book is like compiling ideas into your mind, then you forget about it, but it's deep and it's in there somewhere, and then it changes the way you look at the world, and he's okay with forgetting. So I don't know, still working that out.
Yeah, I love that. I'm a new Roam adopter, and I'm waiting for Neuralink to come out so I can just directly plug my brain into the mainframe and not do any work. Well, amazing. Well, I think that wraps up the Q&A. I can't thank everybody enough for the excellent questions. We're going to share kind of show notes in a recording after this. And I mean, we've just covered so much ground. I feel like I just want to go deep on each of these topics. Each of them could have been their own event. But Cedric, I wanted to thank you. And where should people kind of find you online? I have a hunch, but where should folks follow you and read your stuff?
So it's Common Cognition, commoncog.com/blog. And on Twitter is ejames_c.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everybody for joining. Cedric, thanks again. I know it's almost 7 a.m., so you can either go back to sleep or start your day. But just so grateful for the time that you took and all the wisdom that you shared. So thanks everybody for joining.
Right. Thank you.
Awesome. See you, everybody.
See ya.